There are moments in life so ordinary that most people would never remember them. A knock at the door, a question asked by a stranger, a decision made in less than a minute. But every so often, one ordinary moment quietly changes everything that comes after it. This is the story of a woman named Emily Carter, a woman who had almost nothing left to give, yet offered the only thing she still had. On a cold November night, while rain pounded the streets and thunder rolled across the sky, Emily heard a knock at her apartment door. She expected a neighbor, perhaps bad news, perhaps no one at all. Instead, she found an elderly man standing alone in the rain, soaked from head to toe. His coat clung to his shoulders. His hands trembled from the cold. He carried no suitcase, no backpack, no shopping bag, only a small wooden box held tightly against his chest, as though letting go of it was never an option. He never asked for money. He never asked for food. He looked into Emily's eyes with a calmness that almost didn't belong to someone standing alone in a storm, and in a quiet voice he asked, "Would you let me rest here, just for tonight?" Emily had every reason to close the door. She lived alone after losing her husband. She had learned that trust could come at a painful cost. Every warning she'd ever heard told her not to invite a stranger inside. Yet something about the man didn't match the fear that should have filled the moment. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't desperate. He simply waited, as though he had already accepted whatever answer she would give. Emily had no idea that the choice she was about to make would become the turning point of her entire life. Then, exactly 1 week later, a sleek black luxury sedan rolled to a stop outside her apartment building. A sharply dressed attorney stepped out carrying a polished leather briefcase. He walked directly to Emily's door, knocked once, and waited. When she opened it, the man looked at her with quiet certainty before saying, "Mrs. Carter, I've been trying to find you." Emily felt her heart sink. She had never seen him before. Before she could ask why he was there, he spoke again. "Everything changed because of what you did last Thursday." In that moment, nothing made sense. How could one act of kindness bring a lawyer to her door? Who was the elderly stranger she had welcomed into her home? Why did he arrive with nothing except that mysterious wooden box? And why would one ordinary night become the beginning of a story no one could have imagined? Those questions would uncover a chain of events stretching far beyond a rainy evening and a stranger seeking shelter. They would reveal a life hidden behind silence, a decision made without expectation, and a truth that would leave Emily questioning whether chance really exists at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emily Carter was 54 years old, and life had taught her that hardship rarely arrived alone. 2 years earlier, she had buried her husband after a sudden illness that drained not only her savings, but also the quiet future they had spent decades building together. Since then, every morning felt less like a new beginning and more like another hill she had to climb by herself. She rented a modest one-bedroom apartment in an aging building where the walls were thin, the heating worked only when it wanted to, and every unexpected expense threatened to push her further behind. 4 nights a week, while most of the city slept, Emily cleaned office buildings downtown. She vacuumed empty conference rooms where million-dollar contracts had been signed only hours earlier. She emptied trash cans overflowing with half-eaten meals she could never afford. She polished glass doors until they reflected the fluorescent lights above, then quietly moved on to the next floor before sunrise. By the time executives arrived carrying expensive coffee and briefcases, Emily was already on the bus home, hoping no one noticed the exhaustion in her eyes. Money disappeared almost as quickly as she earned it. The refrigerator in her apartment held little more than a carton of milk nearing its expiration date, a few eggs, half a loaf of bread, and a jar of peanut butter that had been stretched far longer than it should have been. Bills covered her small kitchen table, stacked in neat piles as though keeping them organized somehow made them less frightening. The rent was overdue again. The electric bill had been pushed to the following week. Every purchase required careful thought, and even replacing a worn pair of work shoes had become a decision she kept postponing. Yet despite carrying burdens that would have overwhelmed many people, Emily rarely complained. She never asked her neighbors for money. She never shared her worries with anyone. Pride wasn't what kept her silent. She simply believed everyone else was carrying troubles of their own. The storm that had been threatening the city all evening finally arrived with full force. Rain hammered against the windows of Emily Carter's apartment so fiercely that it drowned out almost every other sound. Wind rattled the old building, tree branches scraped against the siding, and distant flashes of lightning illuminated the narrow hallway outside her front door for only a split second before darkness returned. Emily had just finished sorting another stack of overdue bills when 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoed through the apartment. They weren't loud. They weren't hurried. Whoever stood outside wasn't pounding on the door in desperation. Instead, each knock carried an unusual patience, as though the person waiting had already accepted whatever answer might come. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. Very few people visited this building after dark, especially during a storm like this. Her neighbors usually stayed inside, and anyone else would have called before showing up. Instinct immediately warned her not to answer. Living alone had taught her to be careful. She quietly switched off the kitchen light, hoping whoever stood outside might simply leave. But after a few silent seconds, the same 3 gentle knocks returned. Emily slowly walked toward the front window, careful not to make the old wooden floor creak beneath her feet. She gently pulled back the corner of the curtain, just enough to see outside without being noticed. Standing beneath the weak glow of the hallway light was an elderly man she had never seen before. He appeared to be somewhere in his early 80s, his silver hair soaked by the rain that dripped steadily from the brim of his worn hat. Water ran from the sleeves of his faded gray coat and collected around his weathered shoes. He looked exhausted, but not frightened. He carried no suitcase. There was no backpack resting at his feet. Emily couldn't see a wallet, a phone, or anything that suggested where he had come from or where he intended to go next. The only possession he held was a small, worn wooden box pressed tightly against his chest with both hands. Even from inside the apartment, she noticed how carefully he protected it from the rain, shielding it beneath his coat whenever another gust of wind swept through the parking lot. Whatever was inside that little box seemed more important to him than his own comfort. Emily stood there wrestling with a decision that felt heavier with every passing second. Every warning she'd ever heard repeated itself in her mind. Don't open the door to strangers. Don't trust people you don't know. Be careful. Yet something about the old man's quiet posture didn't fit the picture of someone looking to cause harm. He wasn't pacing impatiently. He wasn't shouting for help. He wasn't trying to force his way inside. He simply waited. Finally, Emily unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door only a few inches. Cold air rushed into the apartment, carrying the smell of rain and wet pavement. The elderly man looked at her with tired blue eyes and offered a respectful nod before speaking. Do you know where I might find somewhere warm tonight? His voice was calm, almost apologetic, as though asking the question embarrassed him. He never mentioned money. He never asked for food. He didn't invent a dramatic story hoping to earn sympathy. It was one simple request from a man who appeared completely worn down by life. Emily immediately thought about the homeless shelters across town, but she already knew the answer before reaching for her phone. During storms like this, every shelter filled long before nightfall. She had seen the news reports herself. If she turned him away, there was a very real chance he would spend the night outside in freezing rain. Emily Carter stood silently in the doorway for what felt like an eternity. Every sensible thought urged her to apologize, close the door, and lock it behind her. But when she looked into the elderly man's tired eyes, she saw neither fear nor desperation. Instead, she saw the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent far too many nights carrying a burden alone. Without saying another word, Emily stepped aside and nodded gently. You can come in. The old man lowered his head in gratitude before carefully stepping across the threshold, making sure not to drip too much rain onto the worn wooden floor. He paused for a brief moment as though he understood that crossing that doorway required an enormous amount of trust from a woman who had never met him before. Emily handed him a clean towel and pointed toward the small bathroom. You should dry off before you catch a cold, she said softly. He thanked her with little more than a quiet smile. Even then, he never loosened his grip on the worn wooden box. It remained tucked beneath one arm, protected with the same care someone might give to a priceless family heirloom. Emily noticed it again, but chose not to ask questions. If he wanted her to know, she believed he would tell her in his own time. The apartment wasn't much to look at. but Emily did everything she could to make her unexpected guest feel comfortable. She warmed a bowl of homemade vegetable soup she had planned to save for the following evening, toasted the last 2 slices of bread she had in the kitchen, and placed everything on the small dining table. The elderly stranger thanked her before quietly eating every bite, never rushing, never asking for more despite the hunger that showed on his face. Their conversation remained simple. Emily learned very little about him. He never mentioned where he had come from. He never spoke about family. Whenever she gently asked if someone might be looking for him, he answered only with a polite smile before changing the subject. It wasn't that he seemed dishonest. If anything, he spoke like a man who had carried countless memories for so long that words could no longer do them justice. The only thing he seemed unwilling to place anywhere except in his own hands was the small wooden box, which rested beside his chair even while he ate. Emily offered him the couch, embarrassed that she had nothing better to provide. To her surprise, the old man quietly shook his head. Seeing how exhausted he looked, Emily smiled kindly and said, "Take my bedroom. I'll sleep on the couch." The stranger hesitated, almost refusing, but Emily insisted. Finally, with visible gratitude, he accepted, but morning brought only more questions. When Emily woke just after sunrise, the bedroom door stood open. The bed had been neatly made. The towel she had given him was folded perfectly on the chair. The bowl from dinner had been washed and left drying beside the sink. The elderly stranger was gone. There was no sound of footsteps in the hallway, no sign that anyone had seen him leave. He hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't left a forwarding address or even his name. The only thing waiting for Emily was a single folded sheet of paper resting carefully on her kitchen table. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. Written in careful handwriting were just 6 simple words. Kindness always finds its way home. There was no signature, no phone number, no explanation. Emily read the sentence again and again, hoping it might somehow reveal its meaning. Finally, she folded the note and slipped it into the kitchen drawer, telling herself that the mysterious stranger had simply passed through her life like so many others before him. She finished getting ready for work, locked her apartment, and returned to the routine she knew so well, believing she would never see him or hear another word about him again. She had no idea that, exactly 1 week later, a black luxury sedan would stop outside her apartment, and everything she believed about that unforgettable night would change forever. Exactly 1 week passed, and life settled back into the routine Emily Carter knew all too well. The mysterious note remained tucked safely inside her kitchen drawer, occasionally crossing her mind during quiet moments. But she had convinced herself that the elderly stranger had simply been another traveler passing through difficult circumstances. She returned to cleaning office buildings overnight, paying bills she could barely afford, and stretching every dollar as far as possible. The rainstorm faded into memory, and with each passing day, the strange events of that evening felt more like a dream than something that had actually happened. If anyone had asked Emily whether she expected to see the old man again, she would have quietly shaken her head. She believed their paths had crossed for one brief night and nothing more. But fate had been moving in a direction she could never have imagined. Late Thursday morning, just as Emily finished washing the breakfast dishes, an unfamiliar sound echoed through the apartment complex. It wasn't the usual delivery truck or one of her neighbors returning from work. Through the living room window, she noticed a sleek black luxury sedan slowly turning into the parking lot. The polished vehicle stood out against the aging apartment building like it belonged in another world entirely. Curious, Emily watched as the driver's door opened and a distinguished man stepped onto the pavement. He appeared to be in his late 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit despite the cool autumn weather. His polished shoes reflected the sunlight as he calmly removed a brown leather briefcase from the back seat before making his way toward the building's entrance. There was nothing hurried about his movements. He carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that came from years of professionalism. Emily assumed he must be visiting someone else. There was certainly no reason for a man like that to be looking for her. Moments later, 3 measured knocks sounded at her apartment door. Emily frowned, setting down the coffee mug she had been holding. She wasn't expecting company, and very few people ever visited her without calling first. As she opened the door, the well-dressed man offered a polite smile before removing a small business card from his coat pocket. "Good morning," he said calmly. "My name is Richard Bennett." His voice was steady and respectful, immediately putting Emily at ease. Yet there was a seriousness behind his expression that suggested this wasn't an ordinary visit. Before Emily could ask why he was there, Richard looked directly at her and asked one simple question. "Mrs. Carter, did an elderly gentleman spend the night here last Thursday?" The words struck her like a bolt of lightning. Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she couldn't answer. Images of the rain-soaked stranger, the wooden box, and the handwritten note rushed back into her mind. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered. "He stayed here for one night. Is something wrong?" Richard Bennett lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering with quiet compassion. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The gentleman who stayed here passed away 2 days ago." Emily felt the room grow strangely silent. She gripped the edge of the doorway to steady herself, struggling to process what she had just heard. She hadn't even known the man's name. She knew nothing about his life, where he had come from, or where he had gone after leaving her apartment before sunrise. Yet hearing that he was gone left her with an unexpected feeling of sadness. She remembered his gentle voice, the gratitude in his eyes, and the mysterious words he had whispered during the night. Questions flooded her mind faster than she could ask them. Who had he really been? How had Richard Bennett found her? Why would the death of a stranger bring an attorney to her apartment? Emily Carter. She stared at her own name without moving, unable to understand why a man she had met only once would leave anything behind for her. It wasn't the size of the envelope that caught her attention. It was the care with which it had been prepared, as though every detail mattered. Richard quietly broke the silence. "He asked me to place this in your hands personally." Emily slowly accepted the envelope, feeling its unexpected weight. She assumed it might contain a thank you note, perhaps a final explanation, maybe even directions for returning the mysterious wooden box if it had somehow been left behind. But as her fingers rested against the thick paper, she sensed there was far more waiting inside than she could possibly imagine. Because what the elderly stranger had left for Emily Carter wasn't money, and it wasn't a simple farewell. It was something deeply personal, something that would reveal why, out of everyone in the city, he had chosen to knock on her door that unforgettable night. Emily Carter stood motionless, the sealed envelope resting in her trembling hands as Richard Bennett waited quietly across the kitchen table. For several long seconds, she simply stared at her own name written across the front, unable to understand why a man she had known for less than 12 hours had entrusted her with something so carefully prepared. Finally, she slipped a finger beneath the seal and slowly unfolded the thick sheets of paper inside. The handwriting was steady, elegant, and unmistakably personal. It wasn't the language of a legal document. It wasn't a will or a financial statement. It was a letter, a final message written by the elderly stranger himself. Emily took a slow breath before reading the opening line aloud in almost a whisper. "If you are reading this, then I have already taken my final journey. First, I want to thank you for seeing me as a human being before seeing me as a stranger." Emily paused, already feeling her eyes begin to fill with tears. She had expected answers, but not words that carried so much warmth.